The Chrysler PT Cruiser sold between 2000 and 2010. It has a very mixed history. Was this an innovative car? Curiosity from one of America's most innovative companies, Chrysler, before their management became dominated by Daimler after the, quote, merger of equals? Was it an inefficient, slow, terribly unsafe lemon? I think the truth is probably somewhere in between both of those. This is a cool car that has a bad history, and I want to talk about my opinion about it today. So first off, welcome back, y'all. If you haven't been here to this channel before, please click the subscribe button, and you don't have to mash that like button. Just tickle it for me just a little bit if you would. It really helps with the algorithm. I appreciate it. My name's John, and I don't do in-depth histories of every model and the VIN numbers and how many cars are sold for specific car histories. This is an opinion channel. I'm not an auto executive, I'm not a mechanic, but I am passionate about cars, and I think about them all the time. And I thought about the PT Cruiser a while ago because this is such a distinctive car.
What the?
That was only from about 20 years ago. But I didn't really think there was a story there. But I had some requests in my comments to do the PT Cruiser, and I started looking into it a little bit more. Now, I remember the PT Cruiser. I've seen them, I've driven them, and my overall opinion is very much they're loved and hated. You don't have to look very far, certainly on YouTube, to see videos where people call it the worst car ever. It's horrible. It's a piece of crap. And I think it was either Top Gear or one of the Top Gear guys said it was the worst car in the previous 20 years. Something like that. But it was such a cool car, and it actually sold really well. So as I researched this a little bit, what I found was the interesting part of the story was not the car, it was the guy behind the car. So you got to roll back the clock a little bit to about 1997, and Chrysler came out with a show car, which was called the PT Cruiser. Now, there was a movement in the late 90s and the 2000s in the auto industry for retro cars. You'll see that the Mini came back, Ford brought back the Thunderbird, Plymouth had the Prowler, and then a little bit later in the 2000s, Fiat brought back the 500 as well. And what was interesting about the Pronto is it was heralding back to design of the past, right? But it was not copying a specific car with the limitations that that can bring with it. And the guy behind all this is named Brian Nesbitt. So he was an automotive designer with Chrysler, and he brought out the PT Cruiser, and it became the PT Cruiser. Now, PT actually stands for Plymouth Truck, but Plymouth, as that low price leader in Chrysler's hierarchy, it was going to be canceled. The writing was on the wall. Chrysler had merged in 98, as I recall, with Daimler, and so they went ahead and renamed it as the PT Cruiser, and it became a Chrysler product. What's interesting, I'll go ahead and jump into it, is Brian also produced beforehand, in the mid-90s, a concept called the CCV, specifically heralding back to the Citroën 2CV. And this was intended to be a car for emerging markets before the Tata Nano came out and things like that. They were going to bring this out. Daimler squashed that, so it went immediately to the trash heap. But then afterwards, he went over to General Motors and moved up their ranks. He ended up being the head of all American and Canadian, I believe it was, design. He ended up heading Cadillac, and now he is, I think he's in charge of worldwide design, and he's the brand leader for a couple of their partners. But after he moved to General Motors, he didn't start, but he kind of picked up and started working on the Chevy HHR. And that was eventually released and was intended to herald back to the original Suburban. So you can see a long history here of this dude looking back to the past and trying to find updated ways to bring those concepts, if not copies, to the market. So the Pronto Cruiser and ultimately the PT Cruiser heralded back to the Chrysler Aeroflow, which was a thoroughly modern, advanced car for its age in the 30s, early 30s, late 30s, I believe, and also was an attempt at aerodynamics. And it sold okay, but it was massively outsold by the traditional Chrysler products that they were selling to, and eventually it was just canceled. It's an incredibly famous car. It just never sold really well, but you could kind of see that it was just too futuristic for its own good at the time. So when the PT Cruiser came out, it was released with a 2.4 liter engine that made 150 horsepower, and they eventually offered a 2.2 liter diesel built by Mercedes in Europe, Asia, and South Africa, and also offered a 2.4 liter turbocharged engine, which offered somewhere between 215 and 230 horsepower in the GT version. And they did do a mid-cycle refresh on it, but they offered some cool things. They offered a convertible, which is, your eyes may be different than mine. I don't think it's terribly attractive. They also offered a woody version of it. Advertisements, they played up its flexibility and its cool design, and sales were pretty good. I did not find a breakdown of year by year how the sales were, but they did sell this around the world. They sold some in Japan, they sold some in Australia. They were actually produced at a factory in Austria, and they sold over 1 million, like 1,050,000 over a 10-year period. The mid-cycle refresh did not do anything to improve its looks, and unfortunately, it took the Insurance Institute until, I believe, 2008 to finally test it, crash test it, and it did horrible. In fact, it was the worst performing of the year. So what you end up with is a car that has a reputation for being not very good, crash testing that says it wasn't very good, and a early 2000s Chrysler product that honestly, the engine didn't hold up well, the transmissions didn't hold up real well, and the plastics, the interior were kind of cheap. But it offered a ton of space, and it was a super, super cool car. And what I found in personally talking with people is that kind of mixed feeling about it. I remember riding with a guy once, several of us, we were all going out to lunch, and he had one, and I thought it was the coolest car. It felt a little bit like a gangster car, which is interesting because later the 300 was often called the updated gangster car, right? But that's kind of what this was, and I loved it. And it's based on the Neon, and I had a Neon before, and he absolutely hated it. Now, there was no problems with it. It didn't break down. He had no problems with the engine or anything. He just hated how cheap it was, and it didn't get good gas mileage. It was slightly overweight for the size it actually was. And so the PT Cruisers ended up with this weird place in American history or worldwide history of producing a distinctive car that almost anybody would recognize, that was really, I think, space efficient, but also just does not have a reputation for any kind of durability whatsoever. The convertible is widely regarded as incredibly ugly. They offer that woody version, and so you end up with a car that lasted for 10 years and then just kind of faded away. It has no history before it. It has no heritage after it. It just kind of faded away. So I think the most interesting thing about the PT Cruiser, other than how bad people think it is the fact that Brian Nesbitt was making a career out of building these cool cars that heralded back to earlier ages. Now, he certainly went on and did a lot more traditional things, and specifically at General Motors, I read an interview with him where he talked about they were producing cars that were good but didn't relate well with the consumer, and he was trying to improve that. And honestly, I thought it was pretty interesting because if you look at that time period, some of the changes GM was making in like Chevys and things like that, they started to have better cars that just worked better interior-wise. So that's all I've really got to say about it. I don't have a strong feeling about the PT Cruiser. It's really cool. It was cool at the time, but it's not something I really want to go buy as a used car. It's not something I pine over like a 500 or a Mini. It feels like it just missed its moment, and that it missed its opportunity to really be a modern classic and to really be something special, and instead became an unfortunate footnote in the history of the automobile. So I would love to hear your opinions below. If you owned one and you loved it or you hated it, hey, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks.